Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of American Grit, and we've got two familiar faces with you this week. You've seen them before. We've talked a lot about alternative modalities to mental health treatment on this show, and these are some of the early heads that we brought on in those conversations. They've been running around the state of Texas doing some incredible stuff and the work towards Ibogaine and getting a great deal of money unlocked for research and accessibility in the state of Texas, leveraging HB 802, which opened the door for this conversation to begin with, if you remember. And we talked about that at length over the years. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring to you two of my dear friends that not only are, again, trailblazing across the state of Texas on their advocacy efforts, but I think just two great individuals altogether, speaking from the heart of their authenticity and genuineness towards the subjects of mental health, and the betterment of humankind, right? I think that's a greater conversation that we're having here in these conversations about access to these modalities, right? So Bryan Hubbard, you may know him as the former chairman to the Kentucky Opioid Abatement Advisory Committee out of the state of Kentucky, and is now the executive director of the American Ibogaine Initiative through the REID Foundation here in the state of Texas. And then we have Logan Davidson, who is the executive director of the Texans for Greater Mental Health and the legislative director for the Veterans Exploring Treatment Solution, otherwise known as VETS. So, man, that was a mouthful, guys. Like, you guys are picking up all these titles. It's great. But the work, my friend, the work is what is really fun. And you guys are out there doing it. I just saw you guys on the social medias, recently in the state of Texas, doing some advocacy work on a day of legislative action. So how's it been, man? Guys, gents?
Well, if we go back to an initial organizational meeting among like minds that occurred on October 30 of 2024, where the commitment was made to stake time, reputation, and talent to complete the job that was begun in Kentucky and Texas, there has been a monumental amount of work performed by many servants' hands to bring things a dramatic distance, a distance that I think a lot of folks didn't think that we could cover from the time the legislature convened in January to the time a bill was actually introduced. Was that in March? It took us about 2.5 months to get the bill on the floor, all the way to being within 3 weeks of a concrete decision, one way or another, as to whether Texas will be the first state in the country to ever fund direct drug development through the FDA's process, number one, but number two, to do that with a non-classical psychedelic, as we know now, Ibogaine, as a breakthrough therapeutic for opioid and polysubstance dependency. If this is successful, it will be the greatest single event to occur within the modern psychedelic movement since the passage of the Controlled Substance Act back in the early 70s. And this gentleman sitting right here to my right, Logan Davidson, his organization, Texans for Greater Mental Health, the other organization he represents through VETS, they have helped move mountains within the Texas legislature to help make this a very real possible reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And, no better way of putting it, Bryan, is through the voice of your own. You've been involved in this fight for, some time, and, definitely been carrying a lot of the burden lately and taking a lot of arrows along the way. What better person than Logan, to carry, a lot of it here in the state of Texas as well. Like we've talked about it in the past of your involvement with HB 1802 and why that was such a monumental piece of legislation that has opened the doors for so many things to carry this conversation, not only here in Texas, but in other states around the country, right? Texas likes to be the state, that says that leads the way on a lot of things. And, I think, in these categories, and across all categories, really, like now that I live here, I have to say it, Texas is, it's progressive in a lot of ways. in terms of, bucking the status quo and saying there are better ways of doing things. And it's a no bullshit type of approach. Excuse the language, but, I think that's what makes Texas, Texas. And, with your involvement in 1802, and to what Bryan has talked about and the advancement of where we are today, because I remember those conversations. It was a lot of, oh, that's great. That's really aspirational, guys. Well, maybe one day we'll be able to get there. But here we are. The day is here. We're right around the corner, and some great things are about to happen. So lay it on us, brother.
Yeah. Well, I think, as goes Texas, so goes the nation, which I think there's, 49 other states that might say, we like to lead as well, but you guys don't have a quote about you. So, or at least one that's used so regularly in that way. What we did with HB 1802 was, I think, created a model that said, we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. We think that available treatments aren't working. We think that the available model isn't working. And if the federal government isn't going to take the lead on this, then we will. And I think there's a point of pride for Texas in saying that if the federal government won't do it, then we will. And I think what we have is a legislature that is educated on the subject. And whether they have a deep education on all of the different psychedelic compounds, one of the big things that we've done this session is educate them on Ibogaine. And in 2021, we educated them on psilocybin and broadly on psychedelic-assisted therapy and how effective it was. We showed them the research. We mentioned the Advocacy Day, where we leveraged a dozen special operations veterans and spouses to come and do more than 45 up to 60 meetings with members of House Public Health, Senate Health and Human Services committees, the House Appropriations and Senate Finance committees, to educate them on what the legislation does, but also how this medicine works and how life-changing it can be and life-saving it can be. And I think once they were educated and understood it, they said, okay, we've done this before in kind of this small way. We've taken this small step. Now we're going to take this giant leap and show the entire country what can happen when a state is willing to go out on a limb a little bit. But it's really, I think, not going out on a limb. I think we've seen from the available evidence, like the Stanford trial, which Vets was a participant in and working with Nolan Williams out there at Stanford, that this treatment, when done in a responsible way, is incredibly effective for traumatic brain injury, for PTSD. There's evidence that it's incredibly effective for opioid use disorder, especially opioid withdrawal syndrome. And when presented with the facts and the evidence and with the opportunity, Texas steps up and doesn't let opportunity pass us by.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the conversation that the country is beginning to shift into, is the veteran suicide epidemic that's happening, the overprescribing that's happening, specifically leading to these suicides, which is not, unique to just the veteran community, right? But I think the veteran community is what's bringing it to the surface. And we have a loud voice, right? These conversations that are bringing it to the center. And, I think that is a big conversation to have, right? Is we have far more suicides than we have lost people in combat over the last 20 years. We have people that are struggling with all sorts of addictions, to opioids, to alcohol, to pornography, to whatever their point of escapism is. We have some real problems that are within our community, right? And what people have been looking for a period of time is just a bit of hope. Right, just hope. Right, there's because every day you have to get up and do the same thing, and then I don't have to talk about this to our community. We all know it. We live it every day. But there's not a lot of hope. When you're living in that OODA loop of things, and these types of modalities are giving these veterans a sense of hope, of that fighting chance to say, you know what, it does suck. It sucks a little bit less today because I know that I'm working towards something that can get me to a better tomorrow. And, these medicines are allowing that to happen in many ways. And, Bryan, your background on this is just so fascinating in terms of their commitment to, this movement, right? This energy that hasn't been seen since the 1960s, right? Which was largely wrapped around an anti-war movement, right? And a counterculture within the country that was slapped down very quickly by an aggressive government. And here we are today, where we have nearly 50 years, 60 years worth of dark data, right, that we've overlooked because of the legal aspects of these things, and now they're providing a light and some opportunity. And you've been in this from the government perspective as a representative of the governor, building a team in the state of Kentucky to build a task force to go after these circumstances. For the sake of belaboring that origin story, right? I think it would be important to just kind of wax a little bit on that, and again highlight what is happening and how you've been able to take all those learnings and apply them. Because we talked a little bit before the show, is like, what was that tipping point? What was the drop, right? And I think that is kind of wrapped into your story.
Oh, you ask a very important question that I'm going to try to answer with as much brevity as I can for your audience. By way of history, as you know, I grew up in the coal fields of Virginia, just about 50 miles each way from where West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina all come together. I call it Hillbilly Corner. I come up in a blue-collar family. I had two grade school educated grandfathers who were underground coal miners for about 40 years, and they were God's love in my life in the early years for my parents, who had married young. By the time I came along, their relationship had devolved into a lot of screaming and cussing and chaos. And I can remember my grandfathers taking me as a very scared and confused young boy. And I mean, I couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old. They comprise some of my first memories. Each of those gentlemen would take and pull me aside and say, "You need to know, Papa loves you, Mama loves you. But more importantly, God loves you, and God has a special and unique purpose for your life. And no matter how scared you get, no matter how bad things look, do not give up faith in the knowledge that Papa's given you. God is real, God is love, and God is going to take care of you." Tim, if those gentlemen hadn't taken the time to give me sanctuary from chaos, the stability of their love, and an affirmation of my spirituality, if I were alive at all, there is no question but that I would not be sitting here in the capacity that I am today, having practiced law for 16 years in Kentucky, representing Walmart, Tennessee Valley Authority, and Tyson Foods statewide exclusively, and their workers' compensation litigation during years that coincided with the onset and explosion of the opioid epidemic out of East Kentucky and out across the rest of the country between roughly 2000 and 2016. This evolved into a career in state service for the people of Kentucky, running the state Social Security disability system that I was asked to evaluate and make some proposals for reform that could be modeled nationwide. Came to also run the state's child support enforcement system. When there was a change in administration, when the governor that I served was replaced by current Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, I was let go on hour one of day one of his administration, and then transitioned into the Kentucky Attorney General's office, where I ran the Office of Medicaid Fraud and Abuse Control, investigating and prosecuting medical providers for fraud on that system, as well as the abuse, neglect, or exploitation of any Medicaid beneficiary that they may treat. Because of the record that was acquired through state service when the legislature set up the Opioid Commission in Kentucky to oversee and distribute almost $1 billion in settlement funds, I was recruited to do that job by then Deputy Attorney General Barry Dunn. In preparation for the actual work activity for the commission, one of the first things that we did was travel across the state, and we conducted 20 town halls between September of 22 and May of 23. These town halls were held on Tuesday evenings starting at 6 p.m. I think the least attended one we had about 75 folks. Most of them had between 100 and 200 who would show up. And what began as a 15-minute technocratic presentation of what the commission was, its responsibilities, and how it intended to go about doing its job, we would open the floor up to the community that would gather, and we would hear 2.5 to 3 hours of just an unbelievable outpouring of despair and desperation and grief over everything that these communities had lived, lost, and just had experienced by way of the generational devastation of 30 years of an opioid epidemic. And the common denominator among all of those communities were, we, regular folks, don't have any confidence that you, as a government official, have either the competency or the integrity to do anything meaningful that's going to make any progress in our life or to change these circumstances. And having listened to those 20 town halls, I was reinforced in my belief that at the heart of trauma and addiction is profound spiritual affliction. And when we look at the veteran population, which is ground zero for the trauma that has been caused by the U.S. government within American society going on for 30 years now because of the way in which it has administered its systems, we know that the way in which modern medical systems address trauma and addiction is through the administration of medication that, at their bottom line, anesthetize the soul and ultimately euthanize the body. And what we are here to talk about today is just simply the creation of a viable alternative that works in the very opposite way. As opposed to numbing all of the human being's sensibilities to the pain that they have suffered, we are giving folks an additional therapeutic opportunity to experience the reality of their soul, that soul that dwells within them, that must be recognized, and that deserves restoration as the first and most critical step to the physical restoration that follows.
Man, Bryan, like I can sit in your presence and listen to you talk for days because it speaks right to my soul, man. You and I have talked many years for years around this idea of the opioid epidemic that began in Kentucky, right? You illuminated me to the idea, and to the companies that were involved, Reckitt and Coleman, and how that, empire began in the coal mines of eastern Kentucky. And it's devastating. It's devastating to see where it started and to see that when the state of Kentucky closed down those practices of administering this stuff to the prisoners in the Kentucky system, prison system, they moved on to the veterans and the VHA and started peddling this stuff. And, this opioid epidemic, here we are today where it's claimed so many lives. So many lives. You can't talk to anybody in America today that has not been affected by this, by at least as a degree of separation of one, and it is out of control. We see suicide after suicide after suicide. We just had one here in San Antonio at the Audie Murphy VA Hospital. Right, this Audie Murphy, a Medal of Honor recipient. Right, this guy is a verified badass of all things. They named a hospital after him. Imagine what Audie Murphy would be saying today, knowing that a veteran took his life in the parking lot of named after him because he could not get the care that the VA says that they provide, right? And this is happening, across the country, right? Mark Miller is just one name out of many that take their life, right? In fact, 22 a day is what we hear every day. The administration just celebrated its 100 days of office today. Well, that's 2,200 veterans that have taken their life. 2,200 veterans have taken their life. And this doesn't fall, on my ears lightly, right? And I know the gentleman sitting at this table, you guys are in the fight as well to, really bring these things to the forefront, these opportunities to the forefront. Bryan, you've moved on since that. You're now part of the REID Foundation. That was a developing circumstance in the last time that we had you on the program here. Tell us a little about the REID Foundation and why it's leading the conversation here in the state of Texas, and why you have attached yourself to this organization.
The REID Foundation, the word REID is an acronym that stands for Reaching Everyone in Distress. It is also the name of an individual by the name of Reed Elsass, the son of Rex Elsass. Rex had in his prior life a very long career as a highly successful campaign ad producer for Republicans across the country. He had a son by the name of Reed, who became opioid dependent in his adolescence, and he struggled for 10 years with addiction. Rex was able to get him into some of the most premier, top-notch recovery organizations in the country. Did so repeatedly. And I think Rex has said he's spent almost $1 million through repeated cycles of trying to help REID beat his opioid dependency. Unfortunately, REID lost his battle on June the 2nd of 2019, and he died of a fentanyl overdose. Rex made it his mission, based on his exposure to plant medicine and what he believed to have been an extension of REID's life through ayahuasca ceremony that he traveled to 5 years before his son's death, to devote himself to the creation of music programs in Ohio State prisons for substance-dependent individuals, as well as to help advance the cause of plant medicine when the appropriate opportunities arose. When we had our Kentucky announcement on May 31st of 2023 to launch the Ibogaine Initiative there, Rex was present. Ironically, despite his deeply Republican credentials, I was introduced to Rex by Ms. Melissa Etheridge and her foundation. Your audience may know that she is just a renowned performer from the 90s, also happens to be very left-wing Democrat in her political orientation. So that connection between Ms. Etheridge, who also lost her son to an opioid overdose after he had incurred a sports injury and broke his ankle and had received opioid medication as legitimate treatment that set him on his pathway, Rex became engaged in following the Kentucky process as it played out. On December 15th of 2023, as part of my conviction that we needed to create a monumental unity opportunity for Kentucky around this by making sure that we had a recognition of the necessity of racial unity among poor and working class folks out in the Eastern Mountain who happen to be white, and black folks in Kentucky wherever they exist in numbers, and in the case of my state, that happens to be in the west end of Louisville. On December 15th, that evening, we had scheduled a screening of the Lamar Odom documentary, Lamar Odom Reborn, which was the story of his recovery journey through Ibogaine, which saved his life from substance dependency. That film was due to be hosted at 7 p.m. at the Muhammad Ali Center for Peace and Justice with an overwhelmingly African-American audience whose community leaders had messaged out the Ibogaine Initiative, and we wanted to make sure that the Lamar Odom documentary was shown as a culturally relevant avenue to engage our black brothers and sisters around this project. At 3 p.m. on December 15th, I was summoned to a meeting with the current Kentucky Attorney General and members of his transition team. I thought that was going to be a chance to discuss the Ibogaine project and everything that had come around it. We were going to need the current Attorney General's support in order to proceed with the Commission's known successful vote that was going to be scheduled later in the year. And instead of having the opportunity to talk about all the wonderful things that had gathered around this project, from the commitments of philanthropists who were going to be investment partners with the state to make this happen, as well as drug developers that were ready to come to Kentucky, headquartered there, anchor all of their research and development activity there, and place that state at the head of what's going to be a revolution in neuropharmacology. Instead, I was met with an ambush meeting that ended with not a discussion of the merits or benefits of Ibogaine and what this could do for its state, but a demand for my resignation for having undertaken the project. My first telephone call was to Rex Elsas because the REID Foundation was helping host the screening of the documentary in Louisville. And I said, "You're not going to believe what just happened." He said, "What?" And I said, "I have just been told that I must resign for having done the Ibogaine project here." And I said, "I'm on my way to Louisville for a screening of this documentary to galvanize support among some very precious people whose voices and presence have been absent, not just from Kentucky state politics for far too long, but from this project specifically. And I really don't know how we're going to navigate the discussion. I certainly can't bust everyone's bubble on the evening of this film's premiere." So I went to Louisville. I sat through what was an excruciating 2.5-hour film screening that ended with just a resounding ignition of motivated enthusiasm among that crowd that had gathered there to support this project through and through. And as I saw the inception of the racial unity opportunity that this could bring, I had to sit and know that the project had just been killed. 3 hours before. At the end of the screening, Rex said, if I can open some doors for you based on the career that I've had elsewhere, would you be willing to take what you've tried to do in Kentucky and transplant it? I said, Rex, I bet everything that I am on this. And at this point, knowing what I do now, it is the cause of my life. I will go anywhere. I will talk to anyone, no matter how large or small, important or insignificant, to try to give this life. Started off in the state of Ohio, had a lot of meetings up there for about 4 months, had former South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem just within days of readiness to announce this initiative on her own between May and July of 2024, when a ballot initiative made its way onto the November election in South Dakota that would have seen a substantial reduction in that state's sales tax. And since it's a sales tax only state, Governor Noem said, as much as I would love to do this, my budget outlook is uncertain. I'm looking at a potentially immediate $150 million budget deficit. I can't announce a $42 million project when I've got that kind of hole that's staring me in the face. So, Tim, at that point, I just kind of put my face in my hands and thought, is there ever going to be a viable opportunity for this to take off? And then lo and behold, I got a call from the Lone Star State in late August of 24, and the question was, our legislature has almost a $20 billion budget surplus. They have experience passing psychedelic legislation, and there's a question as to what the next project should be. Do you have any ideas? And I said, in fact, I do. Perhaps Texas will have the requisite degree of vision and courage to take on the Kentucky Ibogaine Initiative and make it its own. And here we are, 3 weeks out from the conclusion of a legislative session that may very well see that reality come to pass.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing story. You know, listening to all of that, isn't it amazing that once you have sat with this medicine, like there's nothing more than you want to do than find ways of getting more people to it. Like that, I don't understand what the spirit behind that is, but you know, you talked about how it has become a driving force of your passion, Logan. I've heard this from you the same over the years. You know, it's become a driving passion of mine. Is it the idea that we're breaking people away from their own despair that is fueling that? I don't know what it is. I often ask the question to people that are on this path, like, what is it that's driving you? And, you know, it's the same that comes back. It's like, we got to get more people to this. We got to get more people to it. You know, I'll throw the question to you, Logan. What is it that's driving you, man? Like, is it the medicine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's so many different answers to that question. I think the simplest answer and the most immediate is I came to the legislature as a staffer. My first time working in the Texas legislature was in 2015 as an intern. I came back in 17, I came back in 19, I came back in 2021, and every single time I came back, the numbers on specifically veteran suicide, but even first responder suicide was the same, and we didn't have any good answers on how we were going to fix that. And then we found one that seemed like maybe it would work. And I think first and foremost, we have to find something that can combat this veteran suicide epidemic. And put very simply, I think fewer people should be dying by suicide. And that is like really the core immediate driver for me, is that there is an emergency and there is an urgency. And, we say 22, but I think we also know that the number could be as high as 44 or could be even higher. Every 11 minutes an American dies by suicide. And that's just suicide. That doesn't include deaths of despair, of addiction, of overdose, of, cirrhosis of the liver due to a lifetime of alcoholism. And psychedelic medicines have the ability, not as a silver bullet, they're just an effective tool in the toolbox, but a tool that appears to be significantly more effective than the other tools that we have available to us right now. And, we've spent 50 years inhibiting our ability to research and get these tools out there. And now we have an opportunity and in the Lone Star State, a government that is enthusiastic about seizing that opportunity to rapidly accelerate their research development and get them out there in a responsible, regulated, medicalized way that says we appreciate the power of these substances. We also respect the power of these substances, but we want to get them to people who are in critical need, who need these life-saving treatments. And so that's what drives me first and foremost.
Yeah. Yeah, right now there's a bill in the state of Texas for exposing the suicide epidemic rate, right? Because it's dirty secrets within the United States is less than half of the states in the country are required by law to report their suicides and the reasons behind those suicides. So that leads to the belief that number is somewhere floating anywhere between 40 to 70, 40 to 80, right? The numbers go up and down, but what we do know is that the Brown study of 30,187 that are being thrown around a lot is not really the true number, and that's nothing more than a canary in the coal mine, to the circumstances we're talking about. And I think it's very when we talk about this, like the suicide epidemic that's happening in our country, and I think, Bryan, you framed this up probably the best, is like, is it an abandonment of our own spirituality that's driving us to these things that are leading us to this despair that is almost, endless for a lot of people. But the moment that they find that they're not alone, right, is like the moment that their life changes.
Just as there is context for an opioid epidemic in Kentucky, there is context for the emergence of what, and I have to credit these folks, Princeton economists Ann Case and Argus Deaton identified, as Logan has referenced, the phenomenon of deaths of despair, which they defined as deaths that are attributable to drug overdose, alcohol-related disease, and suicide. And since 2015, and that was the date on which this dynamic was first identified and published in academic research literature, there have been 1.5 million Americans die these deaths of despair. That exceeds the total number of U.S. soldiers lost in all combat in the history of the United States, which is about 1.3 million people. As a prelude, I think you and I are probably in that same Generation X cohort. As I look across from you as a man who appears to be younger than probably what he really is.
You're too kind.
We were the vanguard generation for the wide-scale dissolution of family, whereby almost as many, if not more, children were born into homes that dissolved for the very first time in American history. The dissolution of family evolved into the dissolution of community. As family has dissolved, as community has dissolved, so has the institutional ability of those centers of American culture that have as their primary responsibilities the maintenance of social cohesion and the production of progress. And within these broad dynamics, all those avenues through which an individual's divinity could be affirmed have been shut down to millions of people. And with all due respect to a lot of very well-intentioned faith leaders, the institutional church over the past 25 or 30 years has become increasingly irrelevant to broad swaths of American society that do not see it as a credible or honest arbiter of those things that have spiritual significance. One of the cultural opportunities that has emerged through the Kentucky experience that has been affirmed in Texas is a recognition of these realities by a lot of conservative individuals who are driven primarily by their faith and the conviction that it brings to them that human beings must be aware of their divinity if they're going to have any chance to not just merely survive, but to thrive. And as the education around the power of psychedelics when administered with the proper setting and the proper intention to illuminate the reality of that divinity is understood, we now see a countercultural movement on the political right side of the ledger, where there is a desperation to reassert the primacy of the human soul within the civic life of American society. And there is a growing recognition, I believe, within the most unlikely of circles, that the medicalization, and this is an important distinction, the medicalization, not the decriminalization, not even the legalization, but the medicalization of psychedelics to address the drivers of these deaths of despair present a wonderful opportunity to re-anchor the individual to their spiritual reality.
Yeah. I certainly agree with that. I've seen it over and over anecdotally, from one person to the next, and you're like, no, this is, at what point do you say this is not, it's nothing more than what it is. Like you're reconnecting to the things that are important, right? You're reconnecting to self in ways that, that no pharmaceutical, no talk therapy with a psychoanalysis will ever bring an individual. I've heard, people say that they've received 60 hours of therapy in a short 6-hour setting of some of these modalities. I wanted to get your opinions on, some of the conversation that's being held at the national levels, right? We're seeing a very receptive, outside of the state politics of things, we're starting to see a very receptive federal government that's talking to from the HHS perspective of psychedelic-assisted therapies to hyperbaric chamber, and looking at these emerging therapies, right, in a whole new light, right? Because what we've heard over the years is like, well, this is precedent. If it doesn't meet these expectations, then we're not going to look at it from a medical perspective, right? And like H-spot has always been thrown out of the door, right? But we are learning today that these modalities are having incredible impacts on brain trauma, TBI, neuroplasticity, regeneration, all those aspects of soft tissue, right? And kind of like forcing the medical industry to take a new look at this stuff in a much different way. Where do you think on the national level, the conversation that's happening at Texas is influencing? Is it driving? Like, what do you guys think from your perspective?
Yeah, I certainly think the conversation in Texas is influencing, if not leading a little bit, the conversation at the federal level. You can look at HB 1802 and look at that as kind of a clear leader to what became the Crenshaw-Luttrell Amendment, the Douglas-Mike Day Act. Texas established a precedent, right? We were the first psychedelic legislation passed in the country. We had the first state-funded psychedelic clinical trial in the country, psilocybin for veteran PTSD, underway right now, Baylor College of Medicine. You had our dear friend, Dr. Lynette Averill, on the pod to discuss that. And then you had 2 Texas congressmen who took up the mantle, right? Dan Crenshaw and Morgan Luttrell, both Navy veterans, who took up something that had been proposed in the past at the federal level. They sharpened that proposal. They turned it into something that could become law. Then they worked with a broad bipartisan national coalition, but it was Texans who took the lead and took what was a state model and turned it into a federal success. And I think now you have certainly an administration and a unified Congress that are potentially prepared to take the next step. But they are once again, I think, going to be looking to Texas on what to do next. Even Doug Collins, the VA Secretary Collins, who has expressed, I think, support on these issues, is still looking to Texas. In his Sean Ryan podcast that I think has certainly made waves in our space, he talked about VETS, which is a Texas-based nonprofit, and the work that VETS has done in this space. And speaking about hyperbaric work, Rosie and Leroy Torres, who I know are also friends of yours, in Burn Pits 360 and the work they've done on toxic exposure, they've done advocacy at the federal level on these modalities. So I think time and time again, you come back to the role of Texas and other states, but certainly Texas in kind of leading. But that to me is how things are supposed to work. The federal government is slow. Intentionally. This was the intent of the framers. The states have the flexibility and the agility to be fast, to try new things, to see what works. Then the federal government is supposed to look and say, this worked, this didn't, and we're going to take what worked and turn it into law. And Bryan, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
You've stated that beautifully in terms of what the federalist system was designed to achieve. Mm-hmm. We recognize that centralized authority, when applied in any context, is a poor deliverer of progress or accountability for lack of progress. In terms of what is occurring in Texas right now, and especially around this Ibogaine Initiative, this has engaged the attention of folks at the highest level of the Trump administration. And having worked in a much smaller scale state government system, the one thing that becomes necessary at the beginning of an administration is to get your hands around the machine itself, to make sure that you have it staffed with folks who are aligned with your policy positions, and then begin to steadily turn that machine in the direction that you need it to turn in order to achieve your priorities. As we all know, the federal machine is a massive, multi-headed hydra beast that is going to require a significant amount of time to adjust and reform. So as we have people on the inside who are aligned with this mission, who are just trying to get a hold of the beast to make it mine and to be able to drive it in a constructive direction, I get the sense that there is a great desire to see opportunities emerge from outside the federal wall, which can be leveraged by those within it to accelerate the achievement of progress. And that is probably as consequential an opportunity that is developing around the Texas Ibogaine Initiative as any other, is to give the federal reformers an external leverage point that they can use to drive progress that's been needed for 30 years.
Yeah. Bryan, God, you get me so fired up on this, right? And you're absolutely right. Like, cause, people forget like the beauty of the federalist system, right? That, although not part of the originality of it, but our cabinet members have an extraordinary amount of power. Right? Like Doug Collins, right? There's things that Doug Collins can do as a secretary amongst the administrators of cabinet that he can do things that don't necessarily need the action of Congress to make those things happen, right? And what we've seen over the last 30 years is meekness in a lot of the people in those positions. They're just not willing to do what is necessary or the boldness to get things done, right? And good, bad, or indifferent, like them or don't like them. Like I'm calling it out as it is as a veteran that is unfortunately stuck inside the system. So I have an opinion, and to change this, you have to make bold decisions, right? And this is one of those things. Like the time is now. It is more clear to me than ever before in our history. Like, if we want to make a real shot at veteran suicide and reducing these deaths of despair, it is now. And we have the motivated people at the top of government. We have a consortium of states that are willing to do it from the bottom, right? I think whatever anybody's opinion is around cannabis again is another door opener for this, in the sense that 27 plus states now have the ability to regulate their own marijuana and THC laws, right? Which will have an impact at some point on the federal system, saying, okay, more than half of the country right now is legislating this. It's going to force an amendment of some sort. Blah. That's the way the system works. I don't know where I was going with any of that, but God dang, it feels good that we're in a position that we have this ability to close the loop, right? To use the voices of so many people.
Yeah, people above the fray, below the fray, and in the fray. And you have just a true groundswell of support in the administration, in the states, researchers. I mean, here in Texas, you have the first psychedelic research center at a public university, the Charmaine and Gordon McGill Center for Psychedelic Research and Therapy at the University of Texas at Austin.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but I have to say, I have to recognize the tremendous difference in the University of Texas and how its researchers have approached this Ibogaine opportunity, and the folks who run the Center for Drug and Alcohol Research at the University of Kentucky, who were inflexibly opposed to every aspect of this. The folks at the University of Texas could not be more different in the way in which they have approached this with enthusiasm. Sorry about it.
Through my research of, just really quickly, since you opened the door on that one, through the research I've done on the University of Kentucky and their relationships with the NIH and all the other organizations that have really proliferated the opioid existence in this country. I mean, it's criminal what they're involved in, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think the McGill Center at UT Del Med is trying to create an entirely new standard, trying to raise the standard. Not that they're the only ones, but raise the standard for psychedelic research across the entire country in the United States. And I think it's incredible that it's happening here in Texas, that it's happening at a flagship university system for us. And I think, as a graduate of a public university, that it's great it's happening at a public university, because so many of the other psychedelic research centers are at the Ivy Leagues, or at, Johns Hopkins, they're at Stanford, they're at Harvard, they're at Yale, which are phenomenal research institutions. But I think it speaks to something very American in our spirit, that it is happening at a public university.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have Dr. Greg Fonzo, who's one of the co-director of that center. You have Dr. Lynette Averill, who was the subject matter expert in passing HB 1802. And there really is, I think, something grassroots about the idea that it's not happening at one institution, it's happening at two. You have the Texas Tech University system, who has expressed vocal interest in participating in the Ibogaine Initiative, and they will not be the last ones. I think you could see a future in Texas where every major university system has psychedelic research occurring, if not a psychedelic research center, making us really the capital of the psychedelic revolution, and following a model where it is research first, science led, and you see science, policy, and culture advancing together instead of a disjointed advancement that actually can inhibit progress rather than accelerate it. Because, what starts here changes the world. And when you do it right, you can actually move very quickly.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you really look at like the underground and where the guerrilla movement is occurring, right? That's arguably happening right here in Austin, right in Dripping Springs, right? There's an incredible amount of things that are happening in that area surrounding the psychedelics. I think the people are at a point now where it's clear as day to us, like the harms that come from psychotropics, or just the big pharma industry, that people are just looking at what's in our food. We're just getting hit from every aspect of our society on these pollutants that are hitting us in every aspect, and people are just looking for something different. Right, something that can break them free of the psychosis that we live in, break us free of the foods that we're putting into our body that are adding to these dilemmas. Right, I see it clear as day when my son is eating red dyes. What that does to his behavior immediately when it's consumed into his body. Right, we've got some serious things that we need to be looking at as a culture, and it really comes into the inputs of what we are putting into our bodies and what we're sustaining.
People are looking for hope.
Yeah.
And I think that's what these offer.
When the zombified stupor of synthetic pharmacology becomes a central feature of American life, we have gone so far afield from how things should function that the time has arrived in this unique conglomeration of circumstances and unlikely partners to break the machine that has imposed that norm upon us over the past 30 years. And I know when I go home to my hometown, and I think we've talked about this before, I can remember as a child walking through the grocery store, a bunch of working class coal mine economy folks. Their bodies were broken down, but their heads were high, their eyes were clear, and they were strong in spirit. Today, when I go home, though the material circumstances have been much more comfortable, the heads are bowed, the eyes are downcast and glazed. There is a zombified dynamic within our country that has been designed through a pharmaceutical industry that as its end goal is to anesthetize the sensibilities of the human being as much as possible, to numb them out from anything they experience in the name of killing the pain. Well, as they have killed the pain,
You've killed the soul.
They have killed the soul.
Yeah, through the work that we've done at the Grunsau Foundation, it is very clear to me, more so than anything in my life, of what is driving a lot of these things, right? And it came to me through the understanding of HBOT, right? It's inflammation causes pain, pain causes addiction, addiction causes suicide, right? And if you can eliminate two of those things, you have saved an individual from the end result, period. And whatever that means, if that means hyperbaric chambers, if that means, riding equestrian therapy, or if that means, Ibogaine in a controlled setting with a qualified administrator, to whatever, right? It is those moments in time that is going to save us, right? Because, there's a sickness here, man. There's a sickness in our country, and you can see it. I see it here in San Antonio. The homelessness rate is out of control. I see it, going back to Chicago, it's out of control. You see it in your hometowns, right? I have dear friends from Hazard, Kentucky. I know exactly what has happened to that area. And it's devastating. It's heartbreaking, right? This country was built on the backs of some of the most greatest human individuals that defied the odds of everything that was thrown their direction. And here we are, the generations that from that, walking around in despair and just trying to find our way because there is no hope in this country. What are we all working towards right now? When I was younger, it was we were going to the moon, right? We're the Challenger and all the other space program that was happening. What do we have today, right? We're fighting over some of the most mundane bullshit in this country, and people are taking their lives and checking out.
I think about, and now we're going to get into some water that's a little far afield, so if you want me to be quiet, I will.
Hey, I like taking journeys.
As we sit here and discuss these dynamics, it has to be noted that all of these things have evolved as that greatest generation that survived the Great Depression and World War II, twin horrors, essentially has transitioned out of the leadership chair and has been replaced by their generational children, the baby boomers. Now, in my anecdotal personal experience, about half of that generational cohort has inherited the very best virtues of that greatest generation and has carried them forward. There is almost a co-equal number that have lived their lives in opposition to those values at every turn. And that part of that generational cohort comprises the locust generation that has descended, has devoured, and has left everybody holding an empty sack and a bill to pay from the consumption. That is a bottom line reality that has driven the past 30 years of American society's evolution. And as Generation X, the millennials, and the generational cohorts that follow come into leadership, there is a tremendous restoration of American society that needs to occur. And I think as we find unlikely allies, and as I experienced in Kentucky, the support for the Ibogaine Project was bipartisan and the opposition was bipartisan. And the question becomes, are you a sheep who's going to be prey? Are you a wolf who's a predator? Or are you going to be a shepherd who's in here to make sure that there is an equal opportunity for freedom and dignity for everyone born into this society? I think the three of us sitting here, we opt to be shepherds. And we need to identify as many fellow shepherds as possible to cast out as many wolves as we can with the days allotted to us.
That's a great analogy, because I think, the Generation X, I think, fills majority of that shepherd's position, right? And that staple, that role, or whatever we want to call it, because they've lived that majority of their life out on the sideline and observing it all and saying, that's a foul. Calling strikes and calling balls, right? And now that we are moving into this position of leadership, right? the opportunity is at our hands now, and we have the position to say we've seen all the strikes and we've seen all the balls, and it's time to start making some better calls in this world, and I think that's what we're seeing. Right, there's that generation getting fired up and saying we're done with this bullshit. Like there's a new day, there's a new horizon coming, and that fires me up, man. Like that really takes me out of that idea of despair and like the gloominess that we've been living under for so very long. It seems like, and like the winds are behind us, and we've got a little pep in our step right now. Like we got to take it to the bank, right?
And I think there's also this critical mass recognition that it's now or never. Mm-hmm. If we don't get about the business of recognizing reality as it is, as opposed to how we want to pretend that it is,
right.
And unless we can get past those conventional divisions that in the past thwarted the ability to cooperate and start making some unconventional partnerships among folks who share values, we're going to lose it.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anybody who is sitting here at this table or anyone within the generational cohort that is X and follows that aims to be the ones who see the loss of American society as it is intended to be.
Yeah, not on my watch, man.
Yeah. I think that's where psychedelics comes in as such an interesting, like, political issue. And it fits into a broader thing that I'm observing, certainly from the political policy perspective, even as we feel so partisan and things are, I think it is fair to say things are so very partisan. Everyone is looking for that thing that bridges the partisan divide. They want to feel unified. And what we've seen everywhere that psychedelic legislation has passed or the psychedelic vote has passed is that it bridges that partisan divide. You're seeing unanimous votes or nearly unanimous votes. The Ibogaine Initiative bill in the House Bill 3717, carried by Representative Cody Harris of Palestine, Texas, who is just a true champion and servant leader. That legislation passed the Public Health Committee 13-0, totally unanimous. Senate Bill 2308, the Ibogaine Initiative Senate companion carried by Tan Parker, that passed the Senate Health and Human Services Committee unanimously. Right? It is incredibly rare, as you may imagine, for legislation to pass out of our healthcare committees in the Texas legislature unanimously. SB 2308 passed the Senate 26-5. That's more than 2/3 support, near unanimously. I can tell you there's a few senators who voted for the Ibogaine legislation who 4 years ago voted against the psilocybin legislation. That reflects that folks are willing to listen, to learn, to watch the implementation, to pay attention to the science, and to say, you know what? I will change my mind. I will say that I was against this, and I'm not flip-flopping. I'm not some hypocrite. I'm not just, fair weather. It's that I have observed, I have been thoughtful, I have been diligent, and I am taking steps to grow and evolve on issues. And this is something that brings people together rather than tearing people apart at a time when people are desperate for things to bring them together. And Senate Bill 2308 has made it from the Senate over to the House. It has been referred to the House Public Health Committee. And, Bryan said 3 weeks. I'm optimistic and think we may have a resolution within 2 weeks on this, because that is how committed our House author, Cody Harris, is to get that Senate bill moving through the House and onto the governor as quickly as we possibly can.
Nice. Is this should I go with the Price is Right 13 days?
I'm reticent to put exact timelines on it, but I can tell you that the House floor schedule came out today, and they're going to be working through the weekend. They'll be on the floor on Saturday and Sunday because they'll be diligently working. And I would venture a guess that in some behind the scenes meetings that Representative Harris was talking to leadership in the House and said, this is my number one priority. And if we're going to be working on the weekend, this needs to be part of what we're working on.
Well, I think one of the reasons why this subject is so easy for people to get behind, like good left, right, and center, right, is that it goes back to the ideas of dinner table politics, right? Those conversations that happen at the family level are the ones that are going to sail through the easiest, right? Because what's really happening at the local level, right? It's talking about Timmy's addiction problem, right? Or, it's talking about, Heidi's alcoholism, right? Or, maybe Pearl, she fell down and now she's really hooked on these fucking opioids, right? Mm-hmm. And we got to get her off that stuff. Those are the conversations happening at the dinner table. So again, it goes to the adjacency of how many people are affected by this, and watching them just get their life ripped away from them right in front of their eyes. Like that is what we're talking about here. Is like we've all seen it. Every one of us has seen it by somebody in our family, friends, or loved ones. It's just
absolutely
watch them get torn up by these medicines, by depression, by despair.
Absolutely. I mean, we've heard the stories from elected leaders, both in the House and the Senate, and even we can look to statewide leadership. Mental health treatment is incredibly near and dear to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. It's a major priority for him. He made it a priority in the previous legislative session, and clearly it's a priority for him this session, and not just mental health treatment, but, addressing neurodegenerative conditions. He is advancing DPRIT, Dementia Prevention Research Institute of Texas. And while the Ibogaine Initiative doesn't fit into that, it fits into this broader priority of his, of we need to address the veteran suicide epidemic. We need to address the mental health epidemic plaguing our entire country, whether it's depression, anxiety, suicidality, the youth mental health epidemic. And then going a step further, for him, we have to do something about these neurodegenerative conditions like MS, like Parkinson's, that we are totally incapable of addressing at this point. And so I think the success that Ibogaine has seen in the Senate is reflective of the prioritization of those issues by the Lieutenant Governor. Yeah. And, we very much appreciate that leadership.
It's a controversial statement and maybe a bit provocative, but, I'll say it nonetheless, is that, one thing I look back at COVID, right, that was a great learning for me was that, we were able to finally start having real conversations in this country about mental health, right? Because up until that point in time, we skirted around it. We touch, we feel, but we didn't really fully commit. I think the level of conversations that we're having now in this country are far more dynamic and developed than what they were 5-6 years ago. And I believe it's because of that, circumstance and time. So with all the stuff that's happening, if people here in the state of Texas want to get involved, if they want to send information to their representative or state senator, where can they go? What do they need to do?
Yeah, if you want to get involved, if you want to reach out to your state representative, your state senator, go to rallytexas.org, RALLY Texas.org. There's a really simple form you can fill out there, puts in your name, email address, your address, and that'll connect you to whose district you live in, and it'll actually help you, give you a little script that you're able to fill out and make it really simple for you to contact and express your support for the Ibogaine Initiative. If you want to get involved past the legislative session ending, which is going to be in about a month, go to T4GMH.com. That's the Texans for Greater Mental Health website, vetsolutions.org. That's vets websites, or REID and that's the REID Foundation website.
And the last day of legislating on this particular issue, so if you want to drop your email, when would I need to get that done, Logan?
June 2nd is the last day of the legislative session, but we are moving fast, so I would encourage you to take action sooner than later.
All right. So you heard it there, folks. rallytexas.org. You got to get that email in before June 2nd. So get those fingers a typing, because we need your voice, and we are right on the edge of getting this whole thing passed. Now, and I hope the next conversation we have is a victory lap, my friends.
Won't that be wonderful?
I think so. I think so.
And just as Logan has mentioned to Texans about rallytexas.org, coming here out of Kentucky with the experience that was had at home, I want to congratulate the people of Texas for having a tremendously dynamic and open governance system that makes a Texas Ibogaine Initiative a credible possibility to achieve. Because of the size and diversity of Texas as a state, there has not been the effectual capture of either state systems or statewide elected leaders by the opioid maintenance industry so that puppet strings can be pulled to kill this initiative, as was done in Kentucky. If the people of Kentucky had had an opportunity to go to a referendum on the Ibogaine Initiative there, I am confident that it would have passed 60-40, and we would have been on to the races in terms of having those clinical trials play out within the state. But the tripartite, how do you say that? The trio of the University of Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who your audience needs to know, along with his father, was a partner at the law firm that represented Purdue Pharma against the people of Kentucky while they were partners at that firm. And having been a partner in a law firm, I understand how the money flow works in that situation. And then the current Kentucky Attorney General, who also comes from a law firm that has a long and resplendent history of representing the opioid maintenance industry, which also funded this guy's campaign. The difference in the leadership of Texas, whether it's its centers of academic excellence or whether it's statewide leadership, could not be more different from that which unfortunately afflicts the people at home. And I just can't thank Texas leaders enough for having given this the opportunity to thrive here.
Yeah, there's certainly a level of independence that happens in the state of Texas rather than anywhere else in the country. And I didn't know about it. I've heard about it, right? Being outside of a member of the state until I finally lived here and participated in the government here. And it is truly unique, truly independent, and truly does not give a shit about what other states are doing, right? Because Texas leads the way.
If I can offer one more thing I think that has contributed to our success is there's a unique advocacy model here in the state of Texas that I hope can be replicated elsewhere. And psychedelic advocacy is, the REID Foundation, in addition to their work in Texas, is a national organization. VETS, although it is a Texas-based nonprofit, is a national organization. Texans for Greater Mental Health is a state-focused advocacy organization. And one of the strengths that gives us is we have a state-focused anchor that has done the work over the 2 years leading up to this legislative session to build relationships and do the education necessary for those national groups to come in and really play the legislative session, but also give them the flexibility to go off when that legislative session ends or go and do the work that Bryan has done to lay the groundwork for the American Ibogaine Initiative that will come next. I think that that's a model that I hope to see replicated in other states, these state-focused anchors that can do the work in the off-season so that way these national groups can come in, make the impact play necessary during the legislative sessions, and then go off to the next legislature. That way we can keep making really significant wins at the state level so we can keep leading and showing the federal government what needs to be done.
And he ain't going to do it, but I'm going to do it for him. This young gentleman's tactical understanding of how to navigate a complicated legislative process, of how to move the chess pieces across the board in a way that very well may be behind the scenes, but is of highest level consequence, cannot be overstated. He has been a tremendous asset, machinist, and sometimes I've joked with him and said, hey, I'm sitting up here watching this locomotive go through the tunnel. I know you're down there shoving the coal in the furnace just as furious as you can make it happen. It's been a true pleasure to be able to watch him in action, and he has been just a fabulous asset for every bit of this that's happened so far.
Absolutely agree. And, I think the saying would be that if your state has a budget, these are your men. It's like the A-team.
Well, it's certainly a team effort, and it's been a joy and a privilege to get to do this with Bryan and with everybody on the team. It's a big coalition, and absolutely, if your state has a budget, give us a call.
There you go. There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust these men with my life, with my mental sanity, and you should too if you're sitting in the position of pulling the levers of some big state financial dollars that can make influences in the mental health of your constituency and your states and your countrymen. So, reach out to these guys. With that being said, my friends, that's a direct report from the state of Texas on where we're at on the Ibogaine initiatives and making the great achievements towards opioid abatement and ridding ourselves of this nasty stuff and, giving people some hope. I think that's awesome. And I think that we need more of that in our country. So until next time, my friends, be kind to one another and wash those stinking hands. We'll see you soon.